The transport shuttle dropped through the purple clouds and Kyle Morrison pressed his face against the window, like a child seeing snow for the first time. Below him, the Galactic Academy spread across the valley in a display of architecture that defied everything he knew about physics. Crystal towers twisted into impossible spirals while floating platforms drifted between buildings carrying students from 100 different worlds. Kyle had grown up on Terra Nova 7, where the tallest structure was a grain silo and the most exciting technology was a tractor that drove itself. His parents farmed wheat under an orange sun, and their biggest dream was that their son might work in the colony administration office. Then the academy. Recruiters came. They tested every young person in the colony and Kyle scored high enough to earn a spot among the stars. His mother cried when he left, and his father shook his hand with rough calloused fingers and told him to make humanity proud now. As the shuttle touched down on the landing pad, Kyle wondered if he had made a terrible mistake. The other passengers filed out with confident steps. There was a Vraxian whose crystalline body hummed with internal light, and a pair of Keltorians whose tentacles moved in patterns that Kyle suspected was their version of excited chatter. A huge Grimlock warrior had to duck through the doorway and its 4 arms carried equipment that looked like it weighed more than Kyle's entire family transport. Kyle grabbed his single bag and followed the crowd into the reception hall. The space was enormous with a ceiling that showed real stars twinkling overhead, despite being inside a building. Holographic signs floated in the air directing new cadets to various stations for registration and orientation. Kyle joined the line marked for humanoid species and tried not to stare at everything around him. The cadet in front of him had blue skin and gills on her neck. The one behind him appeared to be made entirely of animated shadow. After what felt like hours, Kyle reached the front desk where a bored-looking android processed his credentials, Cadet Morrison. Kyle, the machine said in a flat-voiced dorm assignment, Delta 7, Room 342, your orientation, begins at dawn tomorrow. Classes start in 3 days. The android handed him a data pad and a key card. Next, Kyle stepped aside and studied the campus map on his data pad. Delta 7 was across the main courtyard past the combat training center and near what the map labeled as the diplomatic gardens. He shouldered his bag and headed out into the fading evening light. The courtyard was massive with fountains that sprayed water in colors Kyle had never seen. Trees with silver leaves grew in perfect rows and the air smelled like flowers mixed with something metallic he could not identify. Other students walked in groups laughing and talking in dozens of languages. Kyle felt very alone. Then he saw her and forgot how to breathe. The elf woman stood near the largest fountain with her back to him. Her silver hair caught the light from the setting sun and seemed to glow with its own radiance. She wore the dark blue uniform of a senior cadet with patches on her sleeve that marked her as combat certified. But what made Kyle stop in his tracks were the 2 dragons, the smaller one perched on her shoulder with scales that shifted between sapphire and turquoise. It was about the size of a cat with delicate wings folded against its body and eyes that gleamed with obvious intelligence. The larger dragon coiled around her feet like a massive serpent. Its scales were deeper blue, almost black, and when it moved, Kyle could see muscles rippling under its hide. This one was as long as Kyle was tall, with wings that could probably span twice that distance. The elf seemed to sense his staring because she turned around. Her face was angular and perfect in the way that made Kyle think of ancient statues. Her eyes were violet, and they fixed on him, with obvious amusement. She walked toward him with steps that made no sound, and the dragons followed her perfectly. The larger one slithered across the ground while the smaller one maintained its balance on her shoulder without effort. "Hello, new cadet," she said, and her voice had a musical quality that made the words sound like a song. Kyle realized he was staring with his mouth open and quickly closed it. "Hello," he managed to say. His voice cracked slightly, and he wanted to disappear. The elf smiled, and the expression transformed her face from merely beautiful to absolutely radiant. "I am Lyra Silverwind, Senior Cadet and Combat Instructor Assistant." She gestured to the dragon on her shoulder. "This is Ember." Then she pointed to the larger one at her feet. "And this is Storm. They are my companions and my family." Kyle found his voice again. "I am Kyle Morrison, human from Terra Nova." 7 Lyra's smile widened. A human. We do not get many of your kind here at the academy. She circled him slowly, and Kyle felt like prey being examined by a predator. The dragons watched him with the same intense focus. Most humans prefer their own military academies. What brings you to study among the stars? Kyle straightened his shoulders and tried to look more confident than he felt. I want to learn from the best. Earth academies only teach human tactics and human technology. Here I can learn from 1,000 different cultures. Lyra stopped in front of him and nodded with what looked like approval. A good answer. Many species come here seeking only to prove their superiority. You at least seem to understand that cooperation is stronger than competition. Ember chirped from Lyra's shoulder, and the elf laughed. She says you smell nervous. But honest Kyle felt his cheeks burn as it that obvious. Lyra patted his shoulder with surprising strength. Every new cadet arrives nervous. The academy has a reputation for being difficult. She was not wrong. Kyle had heard stories about the training programs that pushed cadets to their absolute limit. Species that could survive in hard vacuum, trained alongside beings that breathed methane. Combat simulations used real weapons with safety protocols that sometimes failed. The dropout rate was nearly 40%, but those who graduated were considered the best of the best. They became ambassadors and fleet commanders and peacekeepers who stood between civilization and chaos. Storm made a low rumbling sound, and Lyra glanced down at her companion. You are right. We should let him get settled. She looked back at Kyle. Have you been assigned your training weapons yet? Kyle shook his head. I report to the quartermaster tomorrow morning. Lyra reached into the air, and her hand disappeared into what looked like a ripple in space itself. When she pulled it back, she was holding a sword. Kyle stared at the weapon. The blade was covered in rust and pitted with age. The edge was dull, and the handle was wrapped in cracked brown leather that looked like it might fall apart if touched too roughly. The whole thing looked like it had been pulled from a trash heap. This, she said with exaggerated ceremony, belonged to my great-grandfather. He was a legendary warrior who fought in the Void Wars and slew 1,000 enemies with this very blade. Kyle looked from the rusty sword to Lyra's face. She was trying to keep a straight expression, but he could see laughter dancing in her violet eyes. Storm made that snickering sound again, and even Ember seemed to be chirping with amusement. I see, Kyle said slowly, and you are giving this priceless family heirloom to a complete stranger you just met. Lyra pressed the sword into his hands. Consider it a welcoming gift. May it serve you as well as it served my ancestor. The sword was heavier than it looked, and the balance was terrible. Kyle could feel rust flaking off under his fingers. He understood the joke immediately. The senior cadet was having fun with the nervous newcomer by giving him a worthless piece of junk and pretending it was something special. He decided to play along. He accepted the sword with a formal bow that he had seen in historical videos. I will treasure this gift and honor your ancestor with every swing of this magnificent blade. Lyra burst into laughter that rang across the courtyard like bells. Several other students turned to look at them, and Kyle saw a few elves among them covering their mouths to hide smiles. I like you, human, Lyra said when she caught her breath. Most species would have been insulted or confused. You have a sense of humor that will serve you well here. She turned to leave with both dragons following close behind. Storm glanced back at Kyle with what he swore was a wink. Good luck at the academy, Kyle Morrison. Something tells me you are going to need every bit of it. Kyle watched her walk away, then looked down at the rusty sword in his hands. It really was the most pathetic weapon he had ever seen. He smiled and headed toward his doormat. Least he had made one friend on his first day, even if she did have a strange sense of humor. His room in Delta 7 was small but comfortable. A bed, a desk, a closet, and a bathroom that used sonic showers instead of water. Kyle unpacked his few belongings and placed the rusty sword on the desk where he could see it in the dim evening light. It looked even worse than before. He tried wiping it with a cloth, but the rust seemed permanent. The blade was so dull he could probably press his finger against the edge without cutting himself. Kyle laughed and shook his head. Tomorrow, he would get a real training weapon from the quartermaster, but he would keep this one as a reminder of his first day and the beautiful elf who had welcomed him with a joke. He fell asleep quickly, exhausted from travel and new experiences. His dreams were filled with purple skies and silver hair and violet eyes that sparkled with mischief. The alarm shrieked at dawn and Kyle jolted awake in confusion. For a moment he forgot where he was and reached for the familiar walls of his childhood bedroom. Instead, his hand touched smooth metal, and reality crashed back. He was at the Galactic Academy. Thousands of light years from home, Kyle dragged himself out of bed and stumbled to the sonic shower. The device hummed to life and vibrations cleaned his skin more thoroughly than water ever could, though he still missed the feeling of hot water. On his shoulders, he dressed in his new cadet uniform, which adjusted itself to fit perfectly. The material was some kind of smart fabric that regulated temperature and repaired minor damage automatically. As he reached for the door, something made him glance back at his desk. The rusty sword lay where he had left it last night, in the dim morning light filtering through his window. It looked different. Somehow Kyle stepped closer and his breath caught. The sword was glowing. Not brightly, but with a soft, blue light that pulsed gently like a heartbeat. The rust had not disappeared, but beneath the pitted surface light moved through the metal in flowing patterns. Kyle reached out slowly, his hand trembling. The moment his fingers wrapped around the leather, handle warmth spread up his arm. The blue glow intensified until his entire room was filled with brilliant light. Words appeared in the air around him, written in a script he had never seen before. Yet somehow he could read them perfectly, as if the meaning bypassed his eyes and went straight to his mind-bearer. Recognized ancient bond, acknowledged star shard awakens for the worthy. The light faded as quickly as it had come. Kyle stood holding a sword that now looked merely old and rusty again, but he had felt something inside it, power that hummed just below the surface, waiting. His hands were shaking. He attached the blade to his belt with fumbling fingers and headed out the door. The academy corridors were filling with students heading to breakfast. Kyle followed the crowd to the main dining hall, which was larger than his entire colony's town square. The space was filled with tables designed for every possible body type. There were pools for aquatic species and perches for those with wings. The air had different sections with various gas mixtures separated by energy fields. Kyle grabbed a tray and moved through the food line. Most of what was offered looked edible, though he could not identify half of it. He took things that appeared safe and turned to find a seat. A hand waved from across the room. Lyra sat at a table with several other elves, and she was gesturing for him to join them. Kyle made his way through the crowded hall and slid into the seat across from her. Ember, perched on the table nibbling at something that looked like crystallized fruit storm, lay beneath the table, and Kyle could feel the dragon's tail curled around his ankle. "Good morning, human," Lyra said with that playful smile. "How was your first night in paradise?" Kyle set his tray down and tried to keep his voice steady. "Interesting. I had very strange dreams." One of the other elves leaned forward. He had golden hair and sharp features that reminded Kyle of carved ice. "I am Taven Moonshade, Senior Combat Specialist." He studied Kyle with obvious curiosity. "You are the human that Lyra gave her joke sword to." The whole senior class heard about it. Another elf, a female with dark hair, laughed. "Did you mount it above your bed like a trophy?" Kyle felt his face heating, but before he could respond, Lyra spoke. "Leave him alone. It was just a bit of fun to welcome a new cadet. Humans appreciate humor." Kyle reached down and drew the rusty blade from his belt. The other elves at the table tried and failed to hide their smiles. One actually snorted with laughter. He laid the sword on the table between them. "Tell me, Lyra, was your great-grandfather really a legendary warrior?" Lyra's smile faltered just slightly. "That part was actually true. He fought in the void. Wars 300 years ago, but that sword is just an old training blade I found in the Academy Museum storage. Nothing special about it at all." Kyle wrapped his hand around the handle. The moment his skin touched the leather, the blade erupted with brilliant blue light. The glow was so intense that conversation stopped at nearby tables. Students turned to stare, and someone dropped their tray with a crash that echoed through the hall. The light danced along the rusted metal, revealing intricate patterns and runes that had been invisible before. Ancient script covered every inch of the blade, telling a story in a language that sang with power. Ember shrieked in surprise and launched herself into the airstorm, scrambled out from under the table with a roar that made several nearby students jump. The dragon positioned himself protectively beside Lyra with his wings spread. The other elf cadets pushed back from the table so fast their chairs tipped over. Tavin's face had gone pale, and the female who laughed earlier looked terrified. Lyra stood so quickly her chair fell backward. She stared at the glowing sword, and all color had drained from her face. Her violet eyes were wide with shock and something that looked like fear. "That is impossible," she whispered. "That blade has been dead for 300 years. Every master smith and grand mage in the Elven Kingdoms tried to wake it. They all failed." The light faded as Kyle released the handle. He looked at Lyra and saw her hands were shaking. "I think your joke just became very serious," he said quietly. Lyra reached across the table with trembling fingers. "May I try?" Kyle nodded and slid the sword toward her. The moment her fingers touched it, nothing happened. The blade remained completely dull and lifeless. She tried again, wrapping both hands around the handle and closing her eyes. Kyle could see her concentrating with everything she had. Still nothing. Tavin grabbed it next with the same result. The other elves passed it around the table, and each one failed to produce even a flicker of light. When the sword returned to Kyle, he picked it up casually. The blue glow immediately returned, bathing the entire dining hall in its radiance. The runes along the blade spelled out words in that ancient language. Only the chosen bearer may wield. Starshard only. The worthy may command its power only. The bonded may unlock its secrets. Lyra sank back into her chair. Storm pressed against her leg, and Ember landed on her shoulder, making worried chirping sounds. "Do you understand what you are holding?" Human Kyle looked down at the glowing weapon in his hands, a rusty old sword that apparently likes me for some reason. Lyra shook her head slowly. "That is Starshard. It was forged by the first artificers when my people still walked between dimensions and spoke with stars. My great-grandfather was its last bearer. When he died in the final battle of the Void Wars, the sword went dormant." She met his eyes, and Kyle saw wonder mixed with fear. "Our greatest smiths tried for decades to reawaken it. Our most powerful mages performed rituals that cost them years of their lives. Nothing worked. The sword chose silence until now." The dining hall had gone completely silent. Hundreds of students from dozens of species were watching their table. Kyle could feel the weight of all those stares. A tall figure in instructor robes approached quickly. He was an elder elf with a silver beard that reached his chest and eyes that looked like they had witnessed the birth of stars. His presence seemed to pull the air tight. Around him, Cadet Silverwind, he said in a voice that commanded absolute respect. "Explain what just occurred here." Lyra stood at attention. Her whole body was rigid with military discipline. "Professor Darkwood, I gave this human cadet an old sword as a welcoming joke. I found it in the museum storage where it had been sitting for centuries." She paused and swallowed hard. "It turns out the sword was Starshard, and he is apparently its new chosen bearer professor." Darkwood's eyes widened slightly. It was the first crack in his composed expression. He turned to Kyle, and those ancient eyes examined him with an intensity that made the young human want to disappear. "Stand, boy." Kyle stood and held the glowing sword. His legs felt weak, but he refused to show it. "Professor." Darkwood circled him slowly. The elder elf examined the blade from every angle. He reached out as if to touch it, then pulled his hand back. Finally, he spoke in a voice that carried to every corner of the silent hall. "This changes everything, young human. You are holding one of the most powerful artifacts in known space. It was forged in the First Age when magic and technology were one. It has chosen you for reasons we may never fully understand." He placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder, and his grip was firm. "That means your time at this academy just became far more complicated. There will be those who want to study you, others who will want to steal that blade. Some may even want to harm you to prevent a human from wielding elven power." Kyle felt his stomach drop. "I did not ask for this. I just wanted to learn." Professor Darkwood's expression softened slightly. "None of us ask for destiny, Cadet Morrison. It simply arrives, and we must choose how to face it." He turned to address the entire dining hall. "Let it be known that Cadet Kyle Morrison is under Academy protection. Anyone who threatens him will answer to me personally." The professor looked back at Kyle. "Come to my office after breakfast. We have much to discuss." He walked away, and conversations slowly resumed throughout the hall, though everyone kept glancing at Kyle's table. Lyra sat back down, and her hands were still shaking. "I am so sorry," she said quietly. "I had no idea. I never would have given it to you if I had known." Kyle looked at the sword in his hands. The glow had faded again, but he could still feel the warmth. Maybe it was meant to happen this way. Tavin leaned forward with newfound respect in his expression. "Do you have any idea what this means?" Human star shard was wielded by the greatest hero in elven history. Songs are still sung about the battles it won. Kyle met his gaze. "I am just a farmer's son from a colony world. I do not know anything about ancient weapons or destiny." Professor Darkwood's office was located at the top of the tallest tower on campus. Kyle climbed the spiral stairs with Lyra beside him. She had insisted on coming along despite his protests. Storm and Ember followed behind them with the larger dragons, claws clicking on the stone steps. The walls were lined with artifacts from 1,000 worlds. Kyle saw weapons that glowed with inner light and armor that seemed to be made of solidified shadow. Ancient texts floated in preservation fields, and holographic displays showed star maps of regions he had never heard of. They reached a door carved from dark wood that showed scenes of battle. It swung open before Kyle could knock enter. Professor Darkwood called from inside. The office was circular with windows that looked out over the entire academy. Books lined the walls from floor to ceiling, and the smell of old paper mixed with something like incense. The professor sat behind a desk made from a single piece of crystal that pulsed with soft light. He gestured to chairs that appeared from nowhere. "Sit, both of you." Kyle and Lyra sat while the dragons settled on the floor. Storm curled protectively around Lyra's feet, while Ember perched on the arm of her chair. Professor Darkwood steepled his fingers and studied Kyle for a long moment. "Tell me, Cadet Morrison, what do you know about the Void Wars?" Kyle searched his memory for anything useful. "Very little, sir. Human history classes mention them briefly. A great conflict 300 years ago that nearly destroyed several civilizations. The Elven kingdoms fought against something from beyond known space." The professor nodded slowly, a simplification, but essentially correct. The Void Wars were fought against entities that exist outside normal reality. They sought to consume all matter and energy in this dimension. He stood and walked to the window. Billions died, entire star systems were erased from existence. It was only through the combined efforts of dozens of species that we survived. And at the center of that alliance was Lyra's great-grandfather wielding Starshard. Lyra shifted in her seat. "Professor, I have heard the stories all my life. My great-grandfather was the greatest warrior of his age, but he died in the final battle. The sword died with him. Why would it awaken now after 3 centuries?" Professor Darkwood turned to face them. "That is the question that will keep me awake for many nights." He focused on Kyle. "Tell me exactly what happened. How did you make the sword respond?" Kyle explained everything. A tyke, strange dreams, waking to find the blade glowing, the words that appeared in the air, the warmth that spread through him when he touched it. The professor listened without interrupting. When Kyle finished, he walked to a shelf and pulled down an ancient book. The cover was made of material that looked like woven starlight. He opened it to a page marked with a silver ribbon. "There is an old prophecy," he said, reading from the text. "When darkness returns and the old ways are forgotten, when the barriers between worlds grow thin once more, the blade of stars will wake in unexpected hands, not of the ancient blood but of the new strength, not of the old ways but of the future path." Kyle felt his mouth go dry. "You think the void entities are coming back, Professor?" Darkwood closed the book carefully. "There have been sign ships disappearing near the edge of known space, astronomical phenomena that match records from before the last war, readings that suggest reality itself is weakening in certain regions." Lyra stood up so quickly Ember had to take flight. "Why has no one announced this? Why are we not preparing?" The professor's expression was grave. "Because we are not certain, and announcing such fears could cause panic across 100 worlds. The Academy leadership and various governments are investigating quietly." He looked at Kyle. "And now a human cadet arrives and awakens the most powerful weapon from that ancient war. I do not believe in coincidence." Kyle gripped the sword at his belt. What do you want me to? Dewey, I'm just a first-year cadet. I do not know how to fight cosmic entities. Professor Darkwood returned to his desk. You will continue your training, but we will accelerate your education. You will study with our best combat instructors. You will learn the history of the Void Wars in detail, and you will train specifically with Starshard to understand its capabilities. He paused. This must remain secret. If word spreads that the legendary blade has awakened, there will be chaos. Species will see it as a sign. Of coming war, others will try to steal it for themselves. Kyle nodded slowly. I understand, Sir. Lyra stepped forward. Professor, I gave him the sword. This is partially my responsibility. I request permission to assist in his training. Professor Darkwood studied her for a moment. You are one of our best combat cadets, Silverwind, and you know more about your great-grandfather's techniques than anyone alive. Permission granted. You will be Cadet Morrison's primary training partner. The professor touched a control. On his desk, and a holographic schedule appeared. Your classes have been adjusted. Combat training every morning. Ancient history in the afternoon. Weapons mastery in the evening. You will have little time for anything else. Kyle looked at the schedule and felt overwhelmed. What about my other studies, engineering and diplomacy? And those will continue, but at a reduced level. Professor Darkwood's tone left no room for argument. This takes priority. Dismissed. Kyle and Lyra left the office in silence. The weight of what they had learned pressed down on both of them as they descended the stairs. Lyra finally spoke. I am truly sorry. Kyle, I never imagined a simple joke would lead to this. Kyle managed a weak smile. At least my time at the academy will not be boring. Storm snorted as if in agreement. They reached the bottom of the tower and stepped into bright sunlight. Other cadets walked past, laughing and talking. None of them knew that reality itself might be under threat. Lyra touched his arm. Come with me. There is someone you should meet. She led him across campus to a building marked as the Combat Training Center. Inside, the space was enormous, with training circles for every fighting style imaginable. Cadets sparred with various weapons while instructors called out corrections. In the far corner, an old elf sat meditating. He had scars covering his face and arms, and one of his eyes was milky white. His hair was pure white, and his pointed ears had notches cut into them. Lyra approached him respectfully. Master Chen, this is Kyle Morrison, the human I told you about. The old elf opened his good eye and studied Kyle. So you are the one who woke Starshard. He stood with fluid grace despite his apparent age. Let me see the blade. Boy Kyle drew the sword and handed it over. Master Chen examined it without touching the handle. The moment Kyle released it, the glow faded. The old elf grunted. It truly is bonded to you. I fought beside the previous bearer, watched him cut through reality itself to strike at our enemies. He handed the sword back. You have big boots to fill. Human Kyle felt the familiar warmth as he gripped the handle. I did not ask for this, Master Chen. The old elf smiled, and it transformed his scarred face. None of the great warriors did. Destiny does not ask permission. Gestured to an empty training circle. Show me what you can do. I need to understand your current skill level before we begin proper training. Kyle stepped into the circle, feeling completely out of his depth. He had done some basic self-defense training on his colony, but nothing like this. Master Chen tossed him a practice sword use that instead of Starshard for now. No need to accidentally cut through the building. Kyle caught the practice blade and took what he hoped was a proper stance. The old elf picked up his own practice sword with casual ease. Come at me when you are ready. Kyle attacked. He lasted exactly 3 seconds before Master Chen disarmed him and put the practice blade against his throat. Again, Kyle tried 4 more times. Each attempt ended faster than the last by the 5th round. He was breathing hard and covered in sweat. Master Chen had barely moved. The old elf lowered his sword. You have spirit but no skill. Your footwork is terrible, and you telegraph every move. Kyle wiped sweat from his face. That is why I am here to learn. Master Chen nodded with approval. Good answer. Pride would have been the wrong response. He gestured to Lyra. Your turn, show him how it is done. Lyra drew her own practice blade and entered the circle. She moved, like water flowing around rocks. Her strikes were precise and controlled. Master Chen actually had to work to defend himself. They fought for several minutes before the old elf called a halt. "Acceptable," he said to Lyra. "You have improved since last month." Turned back to Kyle. "You will train with her every day. Copy her movements until they become instinct. Learn to read your opponent. Most importantly, learn to trust." Starshard Kyle looked down at the ancient blade at his belt. "How do I do that?" Master Chen smiled. "The sword chose you for a reason. Perhaps it sees something in you that we do not yet see. Your task is to discover what that is." Storm made a rumbling sound that might have been agreement. Ember chirped and flew to land on Kyle's shoulder. The small dragon nuzzled against his cheek. Lyra laughed. "It seems you have more supporters than you realize. Even my dragons like you, and they do not like anyone." Kyle reached up to gently stroke Ember's scales. "Maybe I can do this. Maybe I can learn to be worthy of this responsibility." Master Chen clapped him on the shoulder. "That is the right attitude, cadet. Now go get some rest. Your real training begins tomorrow." At dawn, Kyle left the training center feeling exhausted, but strangely hopeful. He had a legendary weapon, a skilled training partner, and apparently some dragons who believed in him. As he walked back to his dorm, the sword at his belt pulsed with warmth. It felt almost like encouragement. Maybe he really could become the warrior. This situation demanded he just hoped he would be ready when the darkness returned. 3 weeks passed in a blur of exhaustion and progress. Kyle woke before dawn every day and trained until his muscles screamed. Master Chen was a merciless instructor who accepted nothing less than perfection. Lyra proved to be an equally demanding training partner. She moved with grace that Kyle could only dream of matching, but she was patient when he struggled. Storm and Ember became constant companions. The dragons seemed to sense when Kyle was pushing too hard and would force him to take breaks. Ember would land on his head and refuse to move until he sat down. Storm would block his path with that massive body, until Kyle agreed to rest on this particular morning. Kyle stood in the training circle facing 3 opponent drones at once. They moved with unpredictable patterns designed to simulate real combat. Master Chen watched from the sidelines, calling out corrections. "Your left side is exposed. Footwork. You are thinking too much." Kyle parried one drone and kicked another. The third came at him from behind, and he spun using a move Lyra had taught him last week. His practice blade connected and the drone fell, but the first 2 were already attacking again. He defended desperately, feeling his energy draining. Then something shifted. Time seemed to slow slightly. He could see the drones moving, and suddenly their patterns made sense. He was not thinking anymore, just reacting. His body flowed from one defensive position to another. Strike, parry, dodge, strike. All 3 drones fell within seconds of each other. Kyle stood breathing hard with his sword raised. Then he realized what he had done and nearly dropped the blade in shock. Master Chen clapped slowly. "Finally, you stopped trying to control every movement and let your training guide you." He walked over and examined Kyle critically. "You are ready for the next stage." Kyle wiped sweat from his face. "What next stage?" The old elf smiled. "Time to train with Starshard instead of practice weapons." Kyle felt his stomach flip. "But I might hurt someone or destroy something important." Lyra entered the circle carrying a small case. "That is why we are going to the deep ranges." She opened the case to reveal what looked like a bracelet made of silver metal. "This is a power limiter. It will restrict Starshard to a fraction of its true capability. You can learn to channel its energy without accidentally cutting through a mountain." Kyle took the bracelet and slipped it on his wrist. It adjusted itself to fit perfectly. "Now draw your sword." Kyle pulled Starshard from its sheath. The blade erupted with blue light as always, but the bracelet began to glow as well. The sword's radiance dimmed to a manageable level. He could still feel the power humming through the metal, but it felt controlled. Lyra led them through campus to an area Kyle had never seen before. They passed through security checkpoints where guards checked their credentials. Finally, they reached a massive door carved with warning symbols. Beyond it was a canyon that stretched for miles. The walls were scarred with blast marks and deep cuts. "This is where the advanced combat cadets train," Lyra explained. The walls are reinforced with the same material used in starship hulls. You can cut loose here without worrying about casualties. Kyle stepped into the canyon, and the door sealed behind them storm, and Ember took flight circling overhead. Master Chen pointed to a boulder the size of a house. Show me what Starshard can do. Strike that rock. Kyle approached the boulder and raised the glowing sword, focused on what he wanted and swung. The blade passed through solid stone like it was made of smoke. The boulder split cleanly in half, and both pieces fell with thunderous crashes. Kyle stared at the sword in his hands. The cut was perfectly smooth. Barely felt any resistance, Master. Chen nodded. Starshard does not cut matter in the traditional sense. It cuts the bonds between particles. The blade can pass through anything if wielded correctly. He gestured to another rock again. But this time do not swing so hard. Feel the blade and let it do the work. Kyle tried again with a lighter touch. The result was the same perfect cut with minimal effort. For the next hour he practiced on various targets, rocks, metal sheets, force fields. Starshard passed through, everything with equal ease. Finally, Master Chen called a halt. Good. You are learning to trust the blade. Now for the difficult part. He turned to Lyra. Attack him. Lyra's eyes widened. Master Chen, he is still learning. If I make a mistake, you will not. The old elf's voice was firm. And he needs to learn to defend against a skilled opponent. Use half speed to start. Lyra drew her own sword with obvious reluctance. Kyle. I am sorry about this. She attacked even at half speed. She was fast. Kyle barely got his guard up in time. Her blade struck his and the impact sent vibrations up his arm, but Starshard held firm. The ancient metal did not chip or crack. Lyra pressed the attack with a combination of strikes that would have overwhelmed him 3 weeks ago. But Kyle had learned. He parried and dodged using the techniques that had been drilled into him. His body moved without conscious thought. Then Lyra swept his legs. Kyle went down hard, and her blade stopped inches from his throat. Dead. Master Chen said calmly. What did you do wrong? Kyle stood and brushed dust from his uniform. I focused too much on her sword, forgot to watch her entire body. Correct again. They repeated the exercise dozens of times. Kyle improved, but Lyra still won most exchanges. She knew tricks he had not learned yet, ways to feint and mislead that caught him off guard. But he was learning. Each round lasted longer than the last. Finally, Master Chen called an end to the session. Enough for today. You have done well. Cadet Morrison. Kyle collapsed to the ground exhausted. Every muscle hurt, and he had new bruises forming. Lyra sat beside him and offered a water container. You are getting better. A month ago, I could have beaten you in seconds. Now you actually make me work for it. Storm approached and laid his massive head in Kyle's lap. The dragon's presence was comforting. Ember landed on Lyra's shoulder and chirped happily. Master Chen remained standing. Tomorrow we begin working with the sword's other abilities. Kyle looked up sharply. Other abilities? The old elf smiled. Did you think cutting through matter was all it could do? Starshard was forged to fight beings that exist partially outside our reality. It has capabilities you have not begun to explore. He turned to leave, then paused. Rest well tonight. We'll need your strength. As the sun set, Kyle and Lyra walked back toward the main campus. The dragons flew overhead playing some kind of aerial game that involved loops and dives. So Lyra said, after a long silence, How are you handling all this? Kyle considered the question. A month ago, I was a farmer's son who had never left his colony world. Now I am training with a legendary sword to fight cosmic entities. He laughed without much humor. I think I am going insane. And this is all a very elaborate dream. Lyra smiled sympathetically. I know the feeling. When Ember and Storm chose me as their companion, I thought I was hallucinating. Having dragons bond with you is not exactly normal, even for elves. How old were you when it happened? Lyra's expression became distant. 12 years old. I found them as eggs abandoned in the mountains. Everyone told me to leave them, but I could not. She looked up at the circling dragons. Best decision I ever made. They reached the dining hall and grabbed food. The evening meal was quieter than Breakfast. Most cadets were exhausted from their own training. Kyle and Lyra found an empty table and ate in comfortable silence. Tavin approached with several other elf cadets. Mind if we join you? Lyra gestured to the empty seats. The golden-haired elf sat across from Kyle. Rumors are spreading about you, human. They say you train in the deep ranges now. Kyle shrugged. Master Chen thinks I need the extra space. Tavin leaned forward. Is it true? You can cut through starship hull material. Kyle thought about the practice session. The limiter keeps the sword's power reduced, but yes, I think at full strength it could cut through almost anything. The other elves exchanged glances. One of them, a female named Kira, spoke up. That is both impressive and terrifying. Kyle met her gaze. I know. That is why I am being careful. Learning slowly. Tavin nodded with respect. A wise approach. Power without control is just destruction. They talked for a while longer about training and classes. It felt good to have something approaching. Normal conversation. When dinner ended, Kyle headed back to his dorm. His body ached, but it was the good kind of pain that came from productive work. He was getting stronger. More skilled, more confident. He just hoped it would be enough in his room. Kyle placed Starshard on the desk and removed the power limiter. The sword immediately blazed with full intensity. Runes along the blade glowed and pulsed. He could feel the weapon reaching out to him, trying to communicate something important. Kyle placed his hand on the blade. Warmth flooded through him and images filled his mind. Battles fought in the darkness between stars, warriors standing against impossible odds. Sacrifices made to protect worlds. And through it all, the sword endured, waiting for its next bearer. Waiting for him. Kyle pulled his hand back, breathing hard. The visions faded, but the message was clear. Starshard had chosen him not randomly, but with purpose. The sword saw something in him, some quality or potential that made him worthy. He just had to live up to that faith. Kyle fell asleep, still thinking about the visions. His dreams were filled with blue light and ancient battles, and somewhere in the darkness between stars, something stirred, something old and hungry that remembered the taste of reality. The entities from the Void Wars were not defeated, only sleeping, and they were beginning to wake. The alarm woke Kyle from dreams of darkness and stars. He dressed quickly and grabbed Starshard before heading to the training center. Master Chen waited in the deep ranges with Lyra and her dragons. Today you will learn the blade's true purpose, the old elf announced. Starshard was not created simply to cut through matter. It was forged to pierce dimensional barriers and strike at beings that exist outside normal space. Kyle felt his mouth go dry. How do I do that? Master Chen gestured and a holographic display appeared showing complex energy patterns. The universe has layers. Our reality sits on top of others like pages in a book. The void entities exist in the spaces between pages. They can reach into our world, but we cannot reach them. He pointed to Starshard. Unless you have a blade that can cut through dimensions themselves. Lyra stepped forward. My great-grandfather used this technique to strike at enemies that could not be harmed by conventional weapons. He would see where they connected to, our reality, and sever those connections. Kyle looked at the glowing sword in his hands. I have no idea how to see dimensional connections. Master Chen smiled. Then we will teach you. For the next several hours, Kyle learned meditation techniques that let him perceive energy flows. It was harder than any physical training he had done. His mind kept wandering and frustration built. Storm settled beside him, and the dragon's calm presence helped. Ember perched on his shoulder, making soft, encouraging sounds. Slowly, Kyle began to sense something, like heat shimmer in the air, but visible to a sense he did not know he had. Reality had texture and depth he never noticed before. Good, Master Chen said. You are starting to see. Now focus on that boulder. Kyle looked at the rock and saw it differently. Threads of energy held it together. Connections between every particle. The sword in his hand hummed with power. Strike at the connections. Not the matter itself. Kyle swung Starshard with focused intent. The blade passed through the boulder and nothing seemed to happen. Then the rock simply ceased to exist. It did not explode or crumble. One moment, it was there. And the next moment, there was empty space. Kyle stared in shock. What did I do? Master Chen nodded with satisfaction. You severed its connection to this reality. The matter was returned to base energy. That is the technique used against void entities. Kyle felt sick. I just erased something from existence. The weight of that power terrified him. Lyra touched his shoulder. Takes great control to use that ability. You must be absolutely certain of your target. My great-grandfather spoke of the responsibility, the burden of wielding such devastating power. Kyle looked at her. How did he handle it? Lyra's expression was sad. He carried it until it crushed him. The final battle of the Void Wars cost him everything. He saved countless worlds, but the price was his life and his sanity. She met Kyle's eyes. That is why you must be stronger than he was. You must find balance, Master. Chen interrupted. Enough philosophy, practice control. Try to sever only part of the next target. They spent hours working on precision. Kyle learned to cut specific threads of reality without affecting others. By the end, he could slice a boulder in half. Without completely erasing either piece, it was exhausting work that left him mentally drained as the sun began to set. Alarms suddenly blared across the academy. Red lights flashed, and a voice echoed through the canyon. All cadets report to emergency. Assembly. This is not a drill, Master. Chen's face went grim. It has begun. They ran back toward the main campus. Other cadets poured from buildings heading to the central courtyard. Kyle saw fear on faces from dozens of species. Professor Darkwood stood on a raised platform. His voice was amplified to reach everyone, students and staff. 40 minutes ago, our long-range sensors detected an anomaly at the edge of the system. A tear in space, consistent with Void War records. He paused and the crowd erupted, in panicked voices. The professor raised his hand for silence. We do not know if this is a true incursion or a random phenomenon. Fleet ships are investigating. All Academy defenses have been activated. You will remain here under protection until we have more information. Kyle felt Starshard pulsing at his hip. The sword knew. Somehow it recognized what was coming. Lyra grabbed his arm. Kyle, the sword is reacting. Do you feel it? He nodded. It wants to fight. It recognizes the enemy. Taven pushed through the crowd. To reach them, is it true? Are the void entities returning? Before anyone could answer, the sky split open. A tear appeared in the purple clouds like reality itself was being ripped. Through the gap, Kyle could see darkness that hurt to look at. Shapes moved. In that darkness, things that had too many angles and not enough substance. The air filled with a sound that was not quite sound, more like reality, screaming in pain. Students scattered in panic. Professor Darkwood's voice cut through the chaos. All combat. Trained cadets to defensive positions. Everyone else to shelter. Now Kyle drew Starshard and the blade blazed with intensity he had never felt before. The runes along its surface burned like stars. Master Chen appeared beside them. Morrison. You know what you must do. The sword chose you for this moment. Kyle's hands shook, but he tightened his grip. I am not ready. I have only been training for a month. Lyra drew her own blade. You have the most powerful weapon here. That makes you ready enough. Storm roared and took flight. Ember followed her larger companion. Both dragons had fire building in their throats. The tier widened and something began to push through. It was massive, with a form that shifted between states, solid and liquid, and something else entirely. Where it touched the air, reality-warped buildings near the tear began to dissolve at the edges. Kyle felt Starshard pulling him forward. The sword wanted to fight, needed to fulfill its purpose. He took a step, then another. Lyra matched him. Stride for stride. If you are going, then so am. She smiled despite the fear in her eyes. I got you into this mess. Taven and several other elf cadets formed up behind them. We stand together. That is the Academy way, Master. Chen did not try to stop them. He simply drew his own blade. Then let us show this ancient evil that the new generation is just as strong as the old. They advanced toward the tier. Kyle could see threads of energy connecting the entity to this reality. Exactly like Master Chen had taught him, he just had to get close enough to cut those threads. The entity seemed to notice them. It shifted its attention, and the wrongness of it pressed against Kyle's mind. This thing did not belong in their universe. It was fundamentally incompatible with life and matter. and Timestorm dove at the entity breathing fire. The flames washed over its surface but did no damage. Ember followed with her own attack. Same result. The creature reached toward them with appendages that flickered in and out of existence. Kyle ran forward, raising Starshard. The sword's light grew blinding. He could see the threads now, dozens of them anchoring the entity to this dimension. He swung with everything he had. The blade passed through the nearest thread and it severed. The entity recoiled and part of it became less solid, one down. Maybe 30 more to go. Lyra attacked from the other side. Her blade could not cut the threads, but she could distract the creature. The other cadets spread out, creating multiple targets. Kyle moved to the next anchor, point and struck. Another thread severed. The entity was definitely weaker now, but it was also learning appendages lashed out faster and more accurately. One caught Taven and sent him flying. He hit the ground hard and did not move. Kira screamed and rushed. To his side, Kyle felt rage building. This thing had hurt his friends, invaded his new home, threatened everything. Starshard responded to his emotion. The blade's power surged beyond anything he had felt before. All the limiters fell away. Kyle saw every thread, connecting the entity to this reality, saw them all at once. He raised the sword high and brought it down in an arc that cut through space itself. The blade traced a path through dimensions. Every thread severed simultaneously. The entity shrieked with that reality-breaking sound. Then it began to collapse inward. The tear in the sky sealed as the creature was pulled back to wherever it came from. The last thing Kyle saw was darkness folding in on itself. Then everything went quiet. Kyle fell to his knees. Starshard clattered from his grip. Every bit of energy had been drained from his body. Lyra caught him before he hit the ground. "You did it," she whispered. "You actually stopped it." Kyle tried to speak but could not find words. Storm and Ember landed. Beside them, the dragons pressed close. Offering their warmth, Master Chen approached slowly. His scarred face showed pride and sadness mixed together. "You have proven yourself worthy, Cadet Morrison. But this was only a small incursion. A test of our defenses." Kyle managed to look up at the old elf. "You mean there will be more?" Master Chen nodded gravely. "The barriers between dimensions are weakening. The void entities are waking. This war is just beginning." Professor Darkwood's voice carried across the courtyard. "Medical teams attend to the wounded. Damage control teams assess the buildings." Morrison report to me immediately. Kyle stood with Lyra's help. His legs felt weak, but he forced them to work. They walked to where the professor stood. The elder elf examined Kyle with, "Those ancient eyes, you saved countless lives today. The entity could have consumed the entire academy before fleet reinforcements arrived." Kyle met his gaze. "It was the sword, sir. I just held it." Professor Darkwood shook his head. "The sword provides power, but courage and sacrifice come from the wielder. You ran toward danger when others fled. That is what makes a true warrior." He placed a hand on Kyle's shoulder. "The academy will need you in the coming days. We all will." As medical teams worked on injured cadets and repair drones began fixing damaged buildings, Kyle looked up at the now clear sky.